that's always been something that I feel is important for us to maintain the identity in that international sports world, and always identifying the uniqueness of this region.
Hi there, it's WAMC News Director Ian Pickus. And on this episode of the WAMC News Podcast, a conversation with the outgoing head of the Regional Office of Sustainable Tourism in upstate New York. Well, the head of the Lake Placid Regional Office of Sustainable Tourism, or ROOST, plans to retire next spring. For over 40 years, Jim McKenna has led the organization, the regional office that supports tourism, winter sports, and sustainable development throughout the Adirondacks. Among his latest efforts are spearheading getting the International Children's Winter Games and the Winter World University Games to Lake Placid. He advocated for major upgrades to the Olympic facilities and guided the development of a North Elba Lake Placid Destination Management Plan. McKenna is also co-chair of the North Country Regional Economic Development Council. He plans to retire on April 30th, but first, he spoke with our Pat Bradley.
Jim, I know that you've mentioned potentially retiring for a while now. What, led you to make the final decision and to make it now?
Well, Pat, I guess when I look at it and I look where Roost is right now, I think that it's the appropriate time. It's running very well. It has a lot of good systems in place. It has an excellent staff. And I think now's the time to sort of get to the next evolution of the organization.
What do you mean by the next evolution?
Well, I've been really, although it hasn't been called Roost throughout the 42 years just about that I've been with it, it's really over the last 20 years or so, it's really taken on a new direction in regionalization. And I think that we're at the point now where that's well established. The organization seems to have respect in most areas. We're recognized, not only locally and regionally, but statewide and beyond is having good tools in place, and we stay very progressive in the marketplace. And I feel very comfortable that now's the time for me to transition out.
Well, Jim, I want to take a little bit of a look back before we talk about some of what Roost has been and is doing. How did you get started in promoting Lake Placid and regional tourism?
Well, I'll try to make the story short, Pat, but it actually started in 1981 when I was really, it was after the Olympics were over in Lake Placid, and I was trying to really identify sort of what does Placid have to do to move forward? And it came to me that we didn't have what's called a convention bureau that would solicit groups at that time. So I made a presentation to the Town of North Elba board, I think at the end of 1981, and they ended up funding. They agreed, and they provided $35,000 in funding for 1982, and I had a shared employee with the Chamber of Commerce at that time, and from there that's when the organization first started. Stayed that way until about the mid-'80s, where we combined with the Lake Placid Chamber of Commerce and became the Lake Placid Visitors Bureau. And, that stayed in place for a while, but I was recognizing at that time that, there was the Lake Placid Visitors Bureau and there was Essex County Tourism. And really, we should combine those efforts if we could. So over really the late 80s and the early 90s, we started making contact with Essex County government. And in 1990, we combined the two organizations. And at that time, it became the Lake Placid Essex County Visitors Bureau, and stayed that way really throughout most of the 90s. And then, at that time, the main funding for that organization was through the general fund of Essex County, which means local taxpayers were engaged in providing dollars for tourism promotion. Starting in about 1998, we started looking at funding the tourism effort through an occupancy tax. So we spent 2 years putting that together, first locally with the hotels and motel owners and the lodging community of Essex County, then went to the Board of Supervisors with the concept. They liked it. Then we went to the state government, had to go through the Assembly and the Senate, and the governor had to sign off on it. And in 1990, we implemented a 3% Essex County occupancy tax, which was dedicated to Roost and for tourism promotion. That accomplished two things. It gave the organization a steady funding vehicle, and it relieved the Essex County taxpayers of about $1 million in Essex County general fund money. And then we started moving and growing, and we showed some successes throughout the 90s. And then there was interest really from Saranac Lake first that, do you think we can combine efforts with the Lake Placid Essex County Visitors Bureau? So we looked at that, and we decided, yes, that's a good thing. And I guess in the late 90s, early 2000s, we combined, our first combination was with Saranac Lake. And that quickly grew, that there was other opportunities out there. But the trouble we had was having the name Lake Placid Essex County Visitors Bureau. It was kind of hard to get other organizations and other counties and other municipalities to buy into that concept. So that's when we established, I think, about 2008 or 9, we established the Regional Office of Sustainable Tourism. And at first, people were wondering what that was all about. But over the next couple of years, it ended up allowing us to reach out, and Hamilton County came on board, and then Tupper Lake, and then all of Essex County. It seemed to work well. And since then, we've continued to grow. We've made some very significant changes compared to other organizations like ours because we had to we tried to put everybody under one brand of the Adirondacks, but also keep their individual community identities. So we're ending up managing 8 or 9 different destination websites and social media channels. And that's when we made the decision it would be more cost effective if we bring everything in-house. So we decided at that time, and what was really one of the first organizations like ours to do it, we brought all of our design in, all of our data and IT, and we developed our own websites, and it became very cost effective for everybody. So that's sort of how we established Roost and how we're continuing to operate at this time. Then we get to the point where, there's too much success in tourism, and we started, like other areas around the world, you can look at Venice, you can look at a lot of different places where tourism becomes too much of the economy, and there might be at times too many people. So really starting in about 2018, 17, 18, we started talking about the management of destinations. And by the time COVID hit, we had established ourselves as not only a destination marketing organization, but a destination marketing and management organization. And what that means is that you manage tourism primarily for the benefit of the residents. And once you take that component into consideration, it becomes the destination management organization does have to get involved in things like housing and transportation and childcare, because to make a complete destination that's viable for visitors, it has to be a destination that residents like and support. So that's been sort of the last evolution that I've been involved in, but that is now moving forward, and we're really comfortable at this time that it'll continue to move forward.
That was part of a quote that the press release announcing your retirement mentioned, that successful tourism must reflect the needs of the community, as you were quoted, and you were just talking about that in creating the destination management plan. How difficult is that to attain, though? You've been working on that for several years now, and you mentioned some of the challenges like affordable housing, things like that. How difficult has this been as you progress looking at the plan and having it come to fruition?
Well, that always takes time. And, what we like to do, and I'll give you an example of what we've been engaged in this year, that you've got to get the plan in place, and then it takes more multi-years usually to get the plan implemented. But this year I concentrated for the last 2.5 months in my role as the co-chair of the North Country Regional Economic Development Council. And we established this year a new committee called Housing. And what we ended up doing is just about coming to completion now. But what we've done with that is that it's now part of the economic development strategy of the North Country Regional Economic Development Council. Housing is now part of the economic strategy. And what we've done is that we've identified all the challenges that everybody's been talking about. We've got them all listed, and we identified exactly what they are. And then we identified the solutions for each of those. And that's going into the Regional Economic Development Plan. And why that's important is that we've seen over the last 10 or 12 years that when a region gets a concept into the Regional Economic Development Plan, state government then looks at those plans when they try to implement programming. And the answer to the housing challenge throughout the North Country is not going to be the same answer that it is in Long Island or the metropolitan area of New York. We've developed a program now for housing based on all the input from many people that we think we can tackle the housing challenge in the future throughout the North Country. So that's, there's an example. We're Roost, but we spent a lot of time in helping formulate that plan and getting into the regional council's plan so that we can take some action on it in the future.
Jim McKenna, you have been leading Roost and its previous iterations for about 40 years now. What changes have you seen in the region over those 4 decades?
Well, significant change, Pat. And if you don't have change, you don't have growth. You don't have to. You aren't providing the type of atmosphere for a good vacation destination or a good area for residents to live in. And probably the biggest thing that I've noticed over that time, and we're starting to address now, is that the tourism economy, if we look specifically at Lake Placid, approximately 85% of the economy in Lake Placid is built around sports and tourism. And I think we're now at the point that we're making that change. In fact, Roost just brought on board an economic development person with the concept of, to be a better community, we have to diversify the economy. Because if we go through times like COVID again, when there's uncertainty in the tourism market, we better have some other economic opportunities in the region. So I guess the biggest evolution I've seen over my 40 years is strictly identifying tourism as an economic driver, to identifying it as an economic driver, but to be a good community and a good region, we have to diversify our economies.
Jim, you probably could have gone to other jobs, other locations, bigger communities, and done a similar job. Why did you stay in Lake Placid?
Well, 2 reasons, Pat. Number one, the word is Adirondacks. And I made my decision by the time I graduated from college that I wanted to be in the Adirondacks. And, that's always been a driver for me, is understanding. And I spent many years getting people in the Lake Placid market to understand that, the Olympics are great, but the real driver here, long-term, the real differentiator is the Adirondacks. So the Adirondacks is probably the number one reason why I've stayed here all these years. And probably the number 2 reason is the connection to the international sports world. I've been fortunate enough to be engaged in that for 40 years. And, I've gone to many meetings around the world that Lake Placid gets the recognition of some of the biggest cities in the world. And, I think that's always been something that I feel is important for us to maintain the identity in that international sports world, and always identifying the uniqueness of this region overall. So I think those are probably the 2 main drivers that have probably kept me concentrated on the Adirondacks and the greater Lake Placid region.
Do you have memories over those 4 decades that really stand out?
Well, probably when we named the organization Roost, people thought I was crazy. But, it's really worked out well. That sort of sticks out. I think another one that sort of always in my mind has become important is a little bit before Thanksgiving, when Governor Patterson was our state governor, and he decided to ream in some of the New York State budget, and he decided to cut the Empire State Games. And by the next morning, we had made the decision that we were going to continue them. And, we had to rub two sticks together, so to speak, but we pulled it off and we got the Empire State Games. And they're now in a position that bigger than they were when the state ran them. They're affecting a lot of youth, not only in New York State, but around the Northeast. We've also expanded the sports. And I think that's one memory that I cherish looking back on, making a decision and then moving forward with it. And there's probably other examples like that that stick out, but that one is certainly one that I think has a long-term sustainability for this region and the state overall.
Jim, you mentioned earlier the North Country Regional Economic Development Council. You are co-chair of that right now. You retire at the end of April. Will you continue to co-chair that board?
Well, that's a governor's decision, basically. And, I'm retiring from Roost, but I'm not necessarily retiring from the workforce, Pat.
Yeah, I was going to ask if you decided yet what you'll be doing after April 30th.
Yes, I will. It's, but I think right now it's about Roost. And again, it goes back to some of those basic things that I mentioned. It's really a desire and love to see the Adirondack region be successful, maintain its identity. And, I've always been, even though people identify me as an economic developer, it's really been the environment that's been a real driver of a lot of the issues that I've engaged in over the years.
Well, Jim, I'm sure we'll chat again in the next few months.
Let me just comment a little bit on what I think the future holds. I think as we look at sort of the next 25 years or the next 40 years, I think that the Adirondacks will come into their own, meaning that I think what's going on in the world, and especially in the climate situation that we're all in right now, is that this area is going to be sort of rediscovered, and maybe to a point where we don't want it to be over-discovered. We can look at back and what happened during COVID and what this area offered, and I think we have to be super focused on the possibility that this area will be one of those areas that people will identify for climate refugees. And with that said, I guess my concern is right now we're talking about a lack of housing. Let's not get ourselves in a situation where we get too much housing. And even though we like to, be good neighbors and benefactors, I think we've got to recognize that the challenges of the Adirondacks might be different than they are today. And we have to position ourselves over these next 20 years or so to make sure we can maintain the ambience that the Adirondacks has forever. And I'm a little concerned about what's happening in the climate world. And we have to get people off talking just climate change, because that's been talked about for a long time now. And we have to get people start recognizing that we have to start working on climate restoration, and getting people to think in that direction, I think, is going to be the best for our future.
We had acid rain for a while, and that has circled back. 20 years ago, nobody knew about climate change.
Although Roost was driving hybrid vehicles started in the year 2000, way before anybody knew what they were. Another conversation, what will the climate change mean for the future of winter sports? The International Olympic Committee is certainly concerned about that in the future of the Olympic Winter Games. And the University of Waterloo in Canada has completed a study last year. And there's, Lake Placid region is one of the sites that will hold on to its climate longer than other past Olympic sites. So my point is we might be better off, through 2050 or 2080. But if there's not changes in emissions, everybody's going to be affected.
Jim, thanks for taking so much time with me today.
Well, thank you, Pat. I appreciate it.
Okay, that does it for this episode of the WAMC News Podcast. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks to Pat Bradley for that interview. Until next time, I'm Ian Pickus.